Okay, so a couple other things about animation. So we've animated a ball, and again, I taught you the hotkeys as well to create this. Using F5 to create frames and F6 to create keyframes. You can, of course, use the right-click menu, or you could use the little keyframe or the frame button here. So what I want you to do is we've got our ball. Okay, let's make a new layer above ball, and all the layer controls are down here. New layer, folder of layers, delete layer, and a new layer will always kind of default to layer underscore some number 1 or otherwise if you've created a new one. And I'm going to go ahead and name my layer right away. I'm going to name it star. All right, so we had a ball that we're going to move. Now we're going to move a star around, or animate it at least. All right, so we have a new layer named star, and now on this layer, I want you to select the polystar tool, which is this tool that looks like a little hexagon underneath the oval tool. Select that polystar tool. All right, so inside of this polystar tool, now you don't have to draw yet with me, but this will draw just different sided polygons. Kind of interesting. So by default, you can see under tool options, it's set to polygons, the number of sides. So maybe I want to make a 12-sided polygon, a dodecahedron for any geometry nerds. And look, I can draw a 12-sided polygon. But what I would like you to do is switch this from polygon to star. Right. I'm gonna make now we could have as many numbers as we want. If I could make like a 48 pointed star, or I guess 32 is as high as it goes, and make some kind of crazy shape like this, a little starburst shape. But I want a more traditional star, so maybe I'll do the 5-pointed star. It's more of a traditional look. And then I'm just gonna choose a regular fill color. I'm gonna leave the stroke color on nothing, because again, I just don't want an outline around my shape. I just want a single color shape, so I'll leave the stroke on this white with a red line through it, and then I've got a solid fill color, and then I'm just going to draw a star. All right, so I have this 5-pointed star here, and we want to animate this star, but I want to show you 3 other ways to animate besides just moving something. I want to show you scaling, rotating, and fading. So initially, we want to, before we start creating frames and keyframes and tweens and stuff, we want to cover our bases for the 2 golden rules of animation. So the first golden rule is it must be alone on a layer, must be on its own layer. So we have, this is the only shape on our star layer, so we've got that. And next we need to make it a symbol. So once again, you could go to modify, convert to symbol, or you could right click and choose convert to symbol. Or you could actually click this little icon over here in the properties panel, this little arrow next to a clover or something, convert to symbol. Or you want to be quick about it, depending on if you have a keyboard handy, F8 will make a new symbol. There we go. But regardless, 4 different ways to do the same thing, whatever your preference. Again, I do talk a lot about hotkeys in the keyboard because your time is money, and I've spent just countless hours, weeks on end building in this program, and using hotkeys can save you a lot of time throughout the day. So anyway, regardless of how you did it, whether you use this little icon or the top menu or right-click menu or the F8 key, you get this convert to symbol dialog box. And we want to make sure that the type is a graphic symbol, and we want to give it a name. I'm going to name it star. Again, I think it's good to match the name of the symbol to the actual layer name, since they have to, those golden rules we're trying to keep together, having a single symbol on a single layer. So I name it star, and all of a sudden, if I look in my library, I have a ball and a star, and I've got my star here ready to animate. Let's go ahead and set up a 1-second animation for this star. So the first thing we need to do is we need frames. Now, as you can see, because we already had 2 seconds of time, we already had 60 frames of time on the ball layer. When we create new layers, they'll automatically have frames built out that far for us, which is really nice. So as opposed to the first time we did this with the first layer, we don't have to use F5 or this add frame button or insert frames to actually give ourselves frames to work with. We've already got them there. So now we just want to create keyframes. I'm going to use F6 to make a keyframe. So I'm going to make a keyframe on frame 30 on my star layer. So hit F6, and it gives me this little black circle letting me know that something is there. Now, incidentally, if I were to delete an object on a keyframe and it's not there anymore, notice what happens in the timeline, that your little black circle becomes a little outlined circle to show this is what's called a blank keyframe, and show that there's nothing in there. And that's actually really useful to make things disappear when you're ready to have them disappear on the timeline. But I'm going to use Command Z to undo, get back to where I had my keyframe star there. All right, so I have my star on frame 1, my keyframe on frame 30, and now even before I start animating things, I'm going to go ahead and set up the tween first. I'll do this a lot, actually. It doesn't matter what order you go in. I could go in and start rotating and fading and things on this keyframe and then add the tween. But I personally like to add the tween first a lot of times, just so that as I'm doing the motion on the object, then I can see that animation kind of update in real time interactively for me. So all we have to do is put the cursor on the star layer anywhere in between those first two keyframes, right click and choose Create Classic Tween. And that gives us our little purple thing that we can now move stuff around. All right, so we've got our animation ready for 1 full second on our star here. And now let me show you how to rotate and scale. So you've seen before that we can move. So all I have to do is I can just drag this star over here, and now it moves. Great. I'm going to undo that because I don't want this to move. What I'm going to show you is use the free transform tool, which is the second tool down on our tool panel. It's got the arrow with like on top of the little box with nodes at the corners. What that does is that gives us a box around our star here. And now we're able to rotate and scale this. So if I wanted to rotate it, you can see that the cursor changes depending on where you have it on this little lattice box here. So if I have the cursor anywhere on the shape in the middle, the cursor is like these little crosshairs. So I can use this just to drag and move, just like anything else. And Command Z to undo that. If I get the cursor out towards any of these actual corners or nodes on here, it turns into an arrow showing me that I can actually scale. All right, so I grab this corner and I can scale non-uniformly just by dragging around. And if I scale this all out and let it go, then I can scrub through my animation and see that I am animating that scale happen. All right, pretty cool, right? I'm gonna go back and undo that scale. So I'm back to this. I can show you that along with scaling. Now, if you want to scale something uniformly and you don't want to eye it, you can hold the Shift key. Just like when we were drawing our ball here with the oval tool or the rectangle tool, if you hold the Shift key, you'll create a perfect circle or a perfect square. If you hold the Shift key while you are scaling something, it will force it to keep the same aspect ratio and not like get fatter or skinnier. Okay, so we can scale that around. So that's scaling, and you can really grab from any corner. If you want to scale just one side, grab the one side and all that. Now you can also rotate from this tool by taking the cursor and putting a little bit outside of one of the 4 corners. That will give you this little rotate icon, and then you can start to spin the star around. So if I spun it around a little bit, now I scrub through my animation, now I can see that my star is spinning a little bit. All right, and if you hold Shift while you're rotating, it simply just locks the rotation to like 45-degree increments, I believe. Now, let's see, so that's easy enough, rotating and scaling. Notice that we can do these at the same time. I can go to frame 30 and I can actually move this over here, and I can scale it down, and I can rotate it some more, and all three at the same time without ever re-keyframing or retweening, it will now do all of them all together. So now I have a moving and shrinking and spinning little blue throwing star here going through the computer ether. So that free transform tool is really the quickest way to animate on keyframes inside of this. So very cool here. Now, one other thing I want to show you about animation is how to change the actual. I'm going to hit Command Z a few times so I undo those movements and get back to just a single star without any motion. There we go. I'll do that a lot also when animating, is I'll animate, try some things, use undo to undo them, and you kind of iterate back and forth until you finally get what you're happy with. When animating, or when rotating, I should say, it's going to rotate around what's called the registration point. The registration point is this little white thing in the middle. Now, if you recall when we made our symbol, in fact, you don't have to do this part with me, but just to show you, I will draw a quick little box and go to create a new symbol out of it. And there's this registration here, this little box where you can click either in the middle or one of the corners or in the middle of one of the sides. When you create a symbol, you can decide initially where that registration point is, but you can always move it later on. I usually keep it in the center. So what we have is with the star here, we have the registration point in the center so that when we're using the free transform tool, that's what it's going to rotate around. It's going to rotate around the center. All right, now if we wanted to, for example, rotate it around a specific point, with the free transform tool, I can actually take and click and drag this thing to a different spot. So let's say I want to drag it maybe to this point over here. So now I've got the registration point. You can still see the kind of the center of the symbol is there, a little crosshair, but the pivot, so to speak, this little white circle that I was able to move, now that it's there, if I want to rotate, notice that it will actually rotate around that point and around that actual point of the star there. So now I can see, well, it jumps a little bit. I should say that I should have undid my tween first. In fact, I'm going to do that. I'm going to undo for a minute. And I should have mentioned that that is kind of one exception to the rule, is that when you go moving the registration point around, you'll either need to move it to the same in each keyframe, and you may need to redo the tween. But let me try that. With this first keyframe, I'm going to drag the registration point over to this corner. Then I'll go over to the first keyframe and also drag it over to this corner. So those are held by the keyframe. Now that I've got it in the same spot on both of them, now I should be able to rotate it, see that happen properly. There we go. Yep. Now it rotates and kind of uses that point as a hinge or as a constraint, so to speak. So a little bit of funkiness with rotation, just that, you know, by default it may rotate around the center or it may rotate around a specific corner. But using this free transform tool, you can move that rotation pivot around. You'll just want to make sure that you make sure it's in the same spot on however many keyframes you have in your animation, because if it jumps around, then your animation will get a little wonky. So moving and rotating and scaling can all be done nicely through the free transform tool and making keyframes and tweens. Now, whenever I make a tween, once again, it's almost like a third golden rule of animation, if I may. You do want to make sure it's a symbol. You want to make sure it's the only thing in the layer. And then almost always you want to set some kind of easing on this. I'll show you more easing here shortly, but for right now, is leave it on classic ease, and again, either drag this to -100 or +100, and that'll give you some kind of easing on your animation. So if I publish this right now, Command Return or Control Enter, I can see that my star that's rotating around the pivot right there has a nice soft motion arc to it that is just starting out fast, then it rests slowly into place, and that's because of my easing. All right. Now I want you to, so we've got 1 second of animation on the star that just, I've got it rotating the place. Whatever yours is doing, it's fine, just as long as it's either rotating or scaling or something for 1 second. And now I do want to add the next second of animation in here for my star. So I'm going to put another keyframe on the star layer with F6. Gives me a keyframe. And then I'm going to put another tween in here. So I'm going to select somewhere in between these two keyframes, right click, create classic tween. Now I always set the easing right away when I create the tween, just because as soon as I create it, it's already selected. So I just have to go over here into the frame, and maybe I'll do a classic ease in this time. So I'm ready for some kind of animation that's going to start out slowly and then kind of zoom out at the end there, kind of the way this ball does. All right. So what I'd like to do here is, as soon as the star hits, I'd like to start fading the star out. So that's another big thing, is besides just moving objects around the screen, rotating them around the screen, scaling them around the screen, and animating those properties, we can also animate the transparency. Let me show you how that works. So we have to make sure that we're actually on a keyframe. Notice that if I'm just in the middle of my tween somewhere and I select my star, it won't even really let me select it on the stage. All right, so I need to make sure that I'm on an actual keyframe. So I'm going to go all the way over to frame 60 where I have my second keyframe. And as long as I'm over a keyframe position, now I can select my star. And it really doesn't matter if you have the free transform tool. You can do that with that on it. That kind of works as a selection tool also. But just to not confuse the issue, I'm going to go back to the regular selection tool and just make sure that my star is selected. When your star is selected, now be careful not to double click it and accidentally go inside of the editing of the symbol. If you remember back to our first lesson, going inside of the symbol once you've created it lets you edit it, gives you a completely different timeline. So you can see right now I'm inside of the star, shows me scene 1, and I'm at the star level, or I'm in my stars timeline that just has a single keyframe and a single layer 1 here. But I want to make sure I'm at the top level, scene 1. I've got both my star and my ball layers, and I select it on the stage so that over here in the properties panel, where it shows my object, it shows that it's a graphic, shows it's an instance of the star element in the library. Down here, I showed you guys before a little bit where you could manually edit the X and Y properties, or you could manually edit the width and height if you wanted. You can lock or unlock the aspect ratio. That's just some ways if you want to specifically say, okay, I want a star that's exactly this big or at exactly this position. You can manage those through the position and size here. Now, the next kind of little tabbed area besides position and size is color effects. Okay, now color effects, if you drop down, brightness, tint, advanced, and alpha, I want you to choose alpha. And what that does is that gives us a little slider that lets us play with the transparency. All right, so 100% is totally opaque and we can see it completely. And then 0% is totally transparent and we cannot see it. Well, this attribute is animatable. So we already have our keyframes, we already have our tweens. I'm just going to drag this down to 0. And now if I scrub through my animation, I can see that it automatically is animating this thing fading out. So if I test it in the browser, there we go. I can see that I have my easing out resting into place. And then it starts an ease in. It starts to slowly fade it out. And then starts over, kicks back from there. All right, now if I wanted, I could even, besides just fading it out, I can also, at this position, maybe I'll drag the free transform tool again, and I could scale this star down a bit. Now scaling also, it's something to be aware of. Rotating and scaling will both follow wherever that little registration point is. So if you moved it to someplace other than the center, your scale will follow that also. So if I did that, now I test it, and now it's doing both. All right, so those are really the 4 main types of animation, or at least the most common ways to move things around. I'm going to undo my scale there and get it back to before I had that. So you can just use this free transform tool to just willy-nilly move, rotate, and scale things however you want. Make as many different tweens and as many different keyframes as you want to move things around. You want to be very wary to follow we'll say the 3 golden rules. 1, you need it to be a graphic symbol first. 2, you need it to be the only thing on the layer. And 3, you'll want to set up some easing of some kind so your animation is nice and clean and doesn't have like jagged spots where it starts and finishes. It's nice and soft and natural looking. So let me show you, I'm going to set you loose to just animate some random things here in a minute, but let me show you what happens if we break those golden rules, okay? So for example, you don't have to do this part with me, just kind of watch to see what would happen. I do want you to have this bar or this ball and star, just 2 objects kind of moving around, at least to start with. I'm going to hit save. But if I make a new layer, and maybe I'll name this layer test, and let me draw, for example, I'll take the paintbrush tool and maybe I will draw a little squiggle with my stylus pen here. All right, so I've got this awesome blue squiggle. Now, this is the only thing in the layer, but it's not a symbol yet. So let's see what happens if I try and animate this. So I've got this squiggle. Maybe I'll put a keyframe here. Maybe I'll put it at a ½ second this time. I'll select F6, gives me a keyframe. So I can make keyframes, move things around all I want. Now if I go to make a classic tween, okay, it's warning me. It's giving me a dialog box. It's saying the select frames cannot be tweened. You must convert to a symbol in order to tween. So this is actually warning me and telling me, hey, you can't do this unless you actually make it a symbol. So if I hit OK, then what it did is, now typically when you, let me do that again. I'm going to undo and get rid of these tweens. All right, so once again, I just created a shape without making a symbol out of it first. Created a couple keyframes, and now I'm trying to animate it. And it's giving me this dialog box that's saying, hey, this needs to be a symbol. Do you want to convert and create a tween? Whenever you get this, you always want to hit cancel and then go back and make your thing a symbol, because watch what happens. If you just hit OK and let it just do what it's going to do, if you look at the library, it creates what I affectionately refer to as evil tweens. Okay, it will automatically create symbols, but instead of just making one symbol out of the little squiggle, it will make a symbol for each individual keyframe that's on there, a separate one, and that's almost never what you want. It will just kind of name them, tween, numbers, whatever. So if I go back and undo that again, before I created my tween, still undoing, there we go. They stay in the library. Even if you undo past where the evil tweens were spawned, they stay in your library. So if I had, for example, like a whole bunch of keyframes, which as you're animating something a little more complex, like a character walk cycle or something, you might have a bunch of keyframes. If I've got a bunch of them, I select across them and I want to tween in between each one, and I just hit OK, all of a sudden I've got 4 evil tweens now in here. All right, so let me show you another way how we can make these evil tweens. So I'm going to go ahead and revert back. So undoing, I'm going to delete all these. Now I'm actually going to get rid of this keyframe too. So that's one way of breaking the golden rule, is if you just try and animate stuff that's not a symbol yet, it can create symbols for you, but it's almost never the way you want it, because it's a separate symbol on each keyframe, and it makes these evil tweens, and it just turns into chaos, and your animation gets screwed up really quickly. The other way to do it is if it's not the only thing on the stage. Now let me show you how a real common way that this works. Instead of a squiggle, I'm just gonna draw a box, but I'm gonna have a stroke on the box. And maybe I'll drag my stroke up in size a little bit so you can see it. So, all right, perfect. I have this box that has this lighter blue fill, and then it's got this dark purple color as the stroke. Now, I know, okay, I have my layer, I've got my shape. I know I'm supposed to make a symbol out of it before I start animating, so I'm going to go ahead and make a symbol out of it. It's real common to just click the middle and make a symbol out of that. I'll do F8. I'll call this box. But now what I didn't do is select the actual stroke. So that's a really, really common mistake, is if you have an object with a stroke around it, that you want to make sure and select the entire thing by region selecting or clicking in the keyframe before you make a symbol. Because what can happen is now I've got this symbol that I didn't realize I accidentally missed the outline around it that is not part of the symbol. These are still just raw shapes that I can grab part of and move around. But now if I didn't realize that, and I just think I've got my object ready to animate, I can go ahead and make a keyframe, and maybe I won't even tween yet. Oh yeah, I'll throw a tween in there. Create a classic tween, and again, it kind of warns me that, hey, you can't do this because there's stuff that needs to be converted. And I'd hit OK, and then look at my library, and what it's doing is now all of a sudden, not only do I have my box symbol that I created, but it also creates an evil tween on both keyframes, on the ends of the keyframes. And sometimes it's not a big deal, but if you get into actually wanting to fade and rotate and scale and things, sometimes the evil tweens will make it not work as you would intend, and it's really just kind of sloppy setup to let the program create these kind of automatic tweens for you. Because again, now I've got 3 separate symbols for the same object and the same animation, rather than just having one and trying to move what I wanted. So if you ever see evil tweens, as you're animating, every time you create a tween when you're starting off, you're going to want to just peek at your library and make sure that you didn't make a mistake and that you didn't get any evil tweens, and that you're just using the golden rules, making a symbol first and then animating. If you get evil tweens, they can be problematic, because if you just went to try and delete these in your library, it's going to remove them from the stage too. So now I've got this empty dotted line tween with these empty circle keyframes and nothing on them. So I'm going to undo that, bring those back. So in order to get rid of these, we have to kind of undo what we built on this and get back to our original keyframe. So I can select inside of this purple box area and choose Remove Classic Tween. I can select this keyframe, and I could right-click and do Clear Keyframe, but I'm going to choose to use the hotkey, which is Shift F6, to get rid of the keyframe. And now I can go back, and maybe I want to make this whole thing a symbol. Does anyone remember how to unmake a symbol? I showed you how to make and unmake keyframes, make and unmake frames. We use F8 to convert a symbol, but there was a command that would undo a symbol and make it back into an original shape. The hotkey is Command B. It's called Break Apart. It's under Modify and Break Apart, or you could right-click and choose Break Apart. So I'm going to break apart this symbol. So you see, I got these evil tweens, and now I just deconstructed it back to a single keyframe without any symbols on it. Oh, this might still be a symbol. I think I accidentally broke apart the wrong thing. There we go. Okay. So now I'm back to just the raw shape on both the fill and the outline. And once I've done that, now I can get rid of these evil tweens, and they're not going to delete what's on, oops. They're not going to delete what's on my stage, and I can even get rid of this box symbol that we just broke apart, so that to do it correctly, I'll make sure and either marquee select around the object to make sure I get the fill and the stroke, or you can click on the keyframe, which will automatically select everything. But a lot of times, I'll make sure I have a selection just by nudging it a little bit and then undoing and just making sure I have the whole thing. So now that I have the whole thing, I can make a box symbol, and now I can go ahead and animate this however I want, and I'm not going to run into those little evil tweens. So there's just something to be aware of, that a lot of times Animate will warn you, and it will say, hey, this isn't the only thing in the layer, or this needs to be a symbol first. So like, for example, I could create another box and properly make it a symbol, F8. Maybe I'll call this box 2. And now box 1 and box 2 are both on the layer. And if I want to set a keyframe, and maybe I'll move one of them, I want to do a tween. Okay, once again, it's warning us. And again, whenever you get this warning, you're just going to want to hit cancel and figure out what's wrong. Figure out if you've got multiple things in the layer, you need to make a symbol. So it doesn't just have to be items that aren't symbols. You could have 2 symbols, and if they're on the same layer, you're running the same problem. Because if I were to just let it do its thing, it will create evil tweens. But notice in my library that what it did is on each keyframe, it's creating a symbol that holds both objects. So now I've got a symbol with a nested symbol inside of it, and when all I did was try and move one of the squares or one of the rectangles, and all of a sudden that tween is moving both of them together. And when I get to the keyframe, and it like snaps them back into this weird place. So right away, even with something very simple, you can see how it will kind of start to screw things up if you have the program automatically creating these objects for you. So I'm going to get rid of that test thing. I'm going to get rid of these tweens and these boxes. So I'm back to just my ball and my star. And sometimes it can be a little confusing showing you how not to do something. But does that make sense to everyone, how I was breaking those 2 golden rules and how it creates those evil tweens down the side here? Cool. So that's something I'm going to want you to watch out for. Every time you make a tween, just kind of peek at your library and make sure that you're not getting any evil tweens put in there. So what I would like you guys to do, I'd like you just to animate some stuff on the screen. Doesn't matter what it is. You could draw a beautiful little character and have it hop around, or you can just keep making shapes fly over the place. You can keep the star on the ball, or you can get rid of them and do something else. What I'd like you to do is just take 20 minutes or so, 15, 20 minutes, and just animate some stuff and get used to creating objects, creating symbols, creating layers, creating keyframes, creating tweens. Make sure to include your easing on your tween. But just animate some stuff moving around. Sound good?